The Seven Liberal Arts, A Study in Medieval Culture, by Paul Abelson, 1906. Part 3. Rhetoric. A. Technical Study. General Conditions. More than any other of the subjects of the medieval curriculum, rhetoric shows the distinctive characteristics of the age. While in the other branches, grammar especially, the methods and ideals of the later empire were largely followed, being modified only to meet the changing requirements of new conditions, the study of rhetoric assumed an entirely new character. On the one hand, the old practical rhetorical training of the Roman period was almost entirely discarded, or was reduced to a mere mastery of the technical rules of the science. On the other hand, one insignificant phase of classical rhetoric, the study of the epistle and dictamen, was overemphasized and developed to such an extent as to displace in the curriculum the study of rhetoric proper. This change was not made without reason. The decadence of the rhetorical schools of Rome was caused by the deadening formalism which resulted from perpetuating the ideal of training orators at a time when the world had no use for orators. In the days of Cicero, the training in oratory was in harmony with the spirit of the age. Since its noblest use was then the defense of liberty, his 7 works on eloquence were timely treatises indeed. But in the later empire, in spite of changed conditions, this formal training in oratory remained, as we have seen in a preceding chapter, the same as in the period of Cicero. Such an artificial and lifeless system of education could not but be debasing in its influence. Now, as was also shown in a former chapter, while the Christianized Roman world permitted the pagan schools to die, it was not averse to appropriating for its own purposes the essential elements of the culture which these various schools imparted. But it could not, from the nature of things, accept the educational ideal of the ancient world, the training of the orator. Therefore, rhetoric, the basis of education in the empire, lost its importance in the Middle Ages and could no longer be the keystone of the educational arch. How natural that the Christian schools should refuse to place much value on the ars benedicendi, as rhetoric was most generally defined. For the puerilities of youthful declamations, for panegyrics in stiff Latin, and apostrophes to mythological heroes, they of course could have no use. The ability to speak might be of some value to a priest who would preach occasionally, but excellence in that direction could certainly not be his greatest field of usefulness. The opinion of Rabanus Maurus, the Praeceptor Germaniae, can be said fairly to represent the medieval estimate on the value of the study of rhetoric. He says, quote, "It is sufficient if youths give some attention to the study of rhetoric. Even then, not all who expect to enter the priesthood, but only those who are not as yet obliged to devote their time to pursuits of greater usefulness, should study the subject. At any rate, one who wishes to acquire the art of eloquence can do so more advantageously by reading and hearing great orators than by studying the rules of rhetoric." This representative view adequately accounts for the small amount of time given to the technical study of rhetoric as compared with that given to grammar. The lesser number of manuscripts of rhetoric which have been found, and their elementary character, indicate the relative indifference to this branch of the curriculum. Textbooks. While in the technical study of rhetoric, Cicero and Quintilian were throughout the Middle Ages looked upon as models of style, their own works were rarely used as textbooks, possibly enough on account of their considerable size. For school purposes, at any rate, the principles of these masters were transmitted to the Middle Ages through a number of manuals, all of which were composed in the latter half of the 4th century, and through the elementary treatises on the subject in the encyclopedic works of Capella, Augustine, Cassiodorus, as well as through the special work of Alcuin. These treatises range from a mere catalogue of the figures treated by Cicero and Quintilian to elaborate summaries of the essentials of their works. They are small in bulk and number. The most elementary of these treatises, forming as it were a connecting link between grammar and rhetoric, is the 1 De Schematis Lexeos of Julius Ruffianus. The author, who lived in the latter half of the 4th century, made a collection of 44 figures of speech and illustrated them by copious citations from Cicero and Virgil. 2. Of a similar character is the anonymous Carmen de Figuris, of which a number of manuscripts are extant. It contains 63 rhetorical figures, each illustrated by 3 lines taken from different ancient sources on rhetoric, including, of course, Cicero's De Oratore and Quintilian's De Institutis. 3. Less formal and briefer in the treatment of figures of rhetoric are the Schemata Dianeos. Some 15 of the 63 figures in this work are merely named, and the reference to that portion of Quintilian which treats of the figure is indicated. 4. Similar in content and of unique interest is the Liber de Schematibus et Tropis by the Venerable Bede. In this work, the figures are explained and copiously illustrated from the Vulgate. The author justifies his choice of illustrations by arguing that since the figures constitute the most important part of rhetoric, those of the most important books, the Scriptures, are of greatest value and should be used in preference to any others. 5. The typical textbook of technical rhetoric as studied from the Middle Ages is the Libri Tres Artis Rhetoricae by Hirius Fortunatianus, composed in the latter half of the 4th century. Based as it was on the works of Cicero and Quintilian, and written in the catechetical form, the book was widely used, and many manuscripts of the text, some dating even as far back as the 8th century, are extant today. Fortunatianus's work as a school textbook of technical rhetoric was of great value in spite of its defects from the broader standpoint of the art. That it met all requirements of the age can also be seen from the fact that succeeding writers, notably Cassiodorus, largely based their work on it. 6. Based on the works of Cicero and Cicero's own teacher, Hermeticist of Rhodes, is Augustine's fragmentary work De Rhetorica. It need hardly be said that the fame of the author made the book very popular. Its adaptability as a textbook may be judged from the fact that the author himself had been a teacher of rhetoric. 7. Similarly incomplete is the Institutiones Oratoriae of Sulpicius Victor of the end of the 4th century. The fragment extant indicates an elaborate and well-arranged commentary on the elements of rhetoric. The author being a practical jurist, his work naturally emphasizes the aspect of the art most closely connected with the work of the pleader. It was printed at Basel in 1521. 8. The most elaborate technical treatise on the subject, based on Hermeticist, Cicero, Quintilian, and others, is the Ars Rhetorica by Cnaeus Julius Victor, a contemporary of his above-mentioned namesake. Under 27 main headings, the author exhaustively treats all the essentials of the ars. Logical subdivision and relative subordination are the marked characteristics of the work. It is replete with illustrations from Cicero and Quintilian. His work is the first to treat of the epistola as a component part of the ars rhetorica. The epistle was later emphasized to such an extent that the study of this theme came to embrace the entire subject of rhetoric. 9. Briefer in treatment, but equally well arranged, is the Liber de Arte Rhetorica in the Encyclopedia of Capella. The treatment is technical and clear, except for the introductory portions. It is illustrated in parts by examples from Cicero's orations. It can, however, not claim any special distinction as a textbook. Its use was due to the fact that it formed a part of a complete encyclopedia on the 7 liberal arts. 10. A handy textbook, and one even more popular than Capella's work, was the brief abstract from Fortunatianus by Cassiodorus. His De Arte Rhetorica forms a part of the De Institutionis Liberalium Literarum. Brief as it is, the work contains a number of diagrams to bring out the logical relations of the different terms. The 6 pages of Cassiodorus on rhetoric are probably all that the average medieval student of rhetoric memorized. 11. Isidore of Seville is another author whose De Rhetorica is a part of an encyclopedic work on the 7 liberal arts. It is little more than a brief treatment of the Partes Orationis, which in his own work have somehow shrunk to 4. 1. Exordium, 2. Narration, 3. Argumentation, and 4. Conclusion. He gives a considerable portion of his treatise to a discussion of rhetorical syllogisms and law. The addition of the latter is as significant as are the remarks of Victor on the Epistola. 1/3 of his work is devoted to figures, which are briefly defined and often illustrated by examples from many standard classical authors. 12. The De Rhetorica et De Virtutibus of Alcuin is a dialogue between him and Charlemagne, based almost entirely on Cicero's De Inventione and on Isidore's excerpt. Lacking the good qualities of both, it is not wrongly characterized as devoid of originality, ill-digested, dull, and puerile. Nevertheless, it is of considerable importance from our point of view. It is one of the works which mark the transition from the ancient technical treatment of rhetoric, as we have seen it expressed in the preceding treatises, to the later medieval treatment of the subject, typified in the textbooks of dictamen. The later treatises on rhetoric, such as those of Notker, Remigius of Auxerre, of Boncompagno, and of Bernard of Chartres, follow closely the models which have been described. Besides these texts in which rhetoric is treated as a component part of the 7 liberal arts, there exist remains of fragmentary treatments of portions of the rhetorical art. All these, however, may be considered in the nature of commentaries rather than textbooks. The reading of the textbooks on rhetoric was ordinarily all that was attempted in the technical study of this subject. Sometimes, however, certain schools, either because of the special interests of the teacher, or because of the accessibility of books, or because of certain traditions, devoted some time to the reading of Cicero's works on rhetoric, particularly his De Inventione, De Oratore, Topica, and the pseudo-Ciceronian Ad Herennium. In some instances, the works of historians and classical and Christian prose writers, notably the Consolation of Philosophy of Boethius, were also read as part of the study of rhetoric. Such a practice, however, cannot be said to have existed as a general rule. In general, it may be asserted that wherever conditions were favorable, Cicero's and Quintilian's works were read after the technical study of rhetoric as excellent illustrations of Latin rhetorical style. B. The study of the dictamen. General character. While the subject of the theoretical and logical form of rhetoric received comparatively little consideration in the study of the seven liberal arts, two practical forms of rhetoric were assiduously cultivated. These were the epistle and the document, lay or ecclesiastic. We have seen how, even in the early rhetorical textbooks, the epistola were considered one form of rhetorical expression. In the course of time, the demands of the age forced the writers to lay more stress on the mastery of the practical side of rhetoric than on the theoretical conceptions of invention, excitation, etc. In an age when the ability to read and write was the accomplishment of the few, it was surely a great achievement to be the master of a fair prose style. The ability to write a letter to a lay or ecclesiastical official, to make a contract, a will, or to reduce to writing any other formal act of everyday life, of which a record had to be kept, was surely of greater importance to laymen and priests alike than the skill to prepare a well-balanced oration or literary composition. Hence, in the very beginning of the Middle Ages, letter writing and the preparation of ordinary documents began to occupy the attention of the student of rhetoric in his course of the seven liberal arts. Indeed, these studies came gradually to comprise substantially the whole of the rhetoric of the Middle Ages. Charlemagne's laws on the education of the clergy ordered that they should be able to write cartas et epistolas. It can be asserted with a fair degree of accuracy that from the Carolingian period, the study of rhetoric actually became the study of prose composition. The art was called ars dictandi, ars prosandi, or dictamen. The teacher was the dictator, and dictare meant the ability to write private and official prose. Now, such a study naturally presupposes the use of models. But the ancient literature could not afford illustrative material for this new subject. Cicero and Quintilian could only serve as models for oratory, but not for prose composition. Therefore, in teaching this medieval form of rhetoric, the schoolmasters, as in the teaching of grammar, were largely thrown on their own resources and were compelled to look for new models. The amount of material which the teacher of the Middle Ages gathered for this form of instruction is vast indeed. Incidentally, besides showing the manner and method of instruction, these collections give us a comprehensive view of medieval life and the institutions which very few other sources afford. We find there glimpses of the growth of national law, the gradual introduction of the Roman law, the all-embracing relations in which the Church came in contact with the affairs of life. In short, many important phases of the life of the people are revealed to us through these modest school books. The material in these so-called dictamen treatises has attracted the attention of students of the history of Roman law. Following Savigny, who traced the origin of the study of the Roman law in Western Europe to the study of the dictamen in Italy as a part of rhetoric, investigators of this subject have been carefully sifting these formularies. Many a document here found serves to cast light upon the Kulturgeschichte of Europe. It is from this standpoint of Kulturgeschichte that these documents, which have yielded so rich a harvest to the student of jurisprudence, will be examined anew in this chapter. The evidence sifted with that object in view leads to four important generalizations. As space does not permit an elaborate examination and analysis of these sources on which the conclusions are based, the succeeding paragraphs will contain only the typical data supporting the theses. 1. In the study of rhetoric, the preparation of formal documents was introduced in the early Middle Ages. This ars dictaminis which was assiduously cultivated in northern Italy, gradually developed into a special study of the preparation of documents, and eventually into the study of law, which soon became an independent subject of study. The history of the rise of the University of Bologna and the history of literary conditions in Italy in the Middle Ages fully support this thesis. 2. The need which the secular official world and the ecclesiastical chancelleries had for a knowledge of the art of drawing up documents made the study of the artis dictaminis inevitable in the schools of the Middle Ages. The manifold relations of the church and state, the complex interrelation of the feudal society and the prelates, required standards and models of prose composition. This need, the medieval teacher of dictamen was called upon to supply. In these formal model letters and documents, the affairs of state and church were discussed, sometimes by quoting actual letters written by famous personages of the time, sometimes by writing imaginary replies composed by teachers or able students. A few instances may be cited in illustration. The Breviarum de Dictamine of Alberic of Monte Cassino contains the original document of the controversy of Henry IV and Gregory VII. Of the same character, though belonging to an earlier age, the end of the 9th century, is the so-called Formularius of Bishop Salomon III of Constance. The Summa Prosarum Dictaminis of Saxony contains actual documents from the chancellery of the Archbishop of Magdeburg. The Summula Dictaminis of the Cistercian monk Bernold of Kaiserheim similarly owes its material to the archives of Kaiserheim. Lastly, the models in the dictamen of Arnold of Protzan are taken from the archives of the bishopric of Breslau. When such contemporaneous material was not at hand, famous documents of former days, often with appropriate imaginary replies by schoolboys, were incorporated in the collection. Of such interpolated texts, we have many. As a notable example, the Formularius of Baumgartenberg, written in 1302, may be mentioned. This collection takes more than half of its illustrative material from a previous work of Ludolf of Hildesheim. Of his indebtedness, due acknowledgment is made by the author in the following terms. Multas elegantis studi praesenti operi, inservi epistolas quae de magnorum dictatorum formulariis excerptas. 3. The everyday affairs of life requiring official records, wills, commendations, contracts, immunities, manumissions of slaves, etc., called for a knowledge of the preparation of documents of a less formal character. This the schools of the 7 liberal arts supplied in the teaching of rhetoric. By far the largest portion of the material examined does not relate to haute politique, temporal or spiritual, but to everyday exigencies of private life at their point of contact with public affairs. All the collections of the dictamina have models of privilegia, commissiones, citationes, procurationes, donatoriae, petitiones, sententia, confirmationes, appellationes, executoriae, dispensationes, indulgentiae, exemptiones, visitationes, inquisitiones, formatae, obligatoriae, testimoniales, testamenta, emancipationes, permutationes, adaptiones, etc. If the larger portion of these documents relate to matters ecclesiastical, it is only because the Church touched the average man of the Middle Ages at so many points. The part played by the medieval schoolroom in the transmission of more or less technical legal knowledge through instruction and written practice is apparent. More direct proof that these collections of dictamina were not, as might be supposed, mere reference books of the chancelleries of prelates and princes, but were also used as books of instruction, is found in the fact that all of them have prefixed to the models brief treatises on the ars prosandi, or ars dictaminis, or summa dictaminis, or summa prosarum dictaminis, or summa dictaminum, as these are variously called. This didactic introductory portion is as characteristic a part of the collections dealing with great affairs of church and state as of the more modest collections treating of subjects of humbler life. 4. The schools of the Middle Ages evolved a special form of composition, the epistola, and much of the instruction was in this art of letter writing, which, of course, developed with all the minute distinctions of which the medieval mind was capable. That the instruction in letter writing was made an important part in the study of rhetoric can be seen from the fact that all of these collections in their didactic portions lay great stress on teaching the partes epistolae, salutatio, exordium, or the captatio benevolentiae, narratio, petitio, and conclusio are carefully explained, defined, and illustrated. The relation of the epistola to the entire ars dictaminis is duly emphasized. Much attention is given to the salutatio in the treatment of which examples of forms of address suitable to all conceivable grades of ecclesiastical and lay officials are given. Thus, in the brief Summa Dictaminis of Orléans, composed about 1180, in which the didactic portions of the book occupies 7 printed pages, the treatment of the salutatio takes up more than 4.5 pages. In the elaborate Baumgartenberger Formularius, composed in 1302, the didactic portion De Modo Prosandi devotes nearly the whole of the first 6 parts of the work to the treatment of the salutatio. No less significant are the variations in the examples which many dictamina furnish. A form is given with 2 or 3 others as alternatives, showing again that the models which we have before us were used for purposes of instruction, since it is not likely that the routine worker of a chancellery would care to vary his formulae. Thus, in the models for a salutatio ad patrem, Hugo of Bologna gives his rationes dictandi the following variations. 1. Venerabile et delecto patri. 2. Reverendo ac diligendo patri. 3. A genitori dulcissimo eius dilectus filius perennem cum fidelitati servitium. 4. Quiquid patri peramens filius. 5. Quiquid domino subditus servulus. Still more significant is the form of salutatio given by the same author in the model Ad Amicum, in which no less than 16 variations are given. The numerous glosses which many of these manuscripts exhibit show again that they were used as textbooks. The foregoing portions of this chapter have established the important position which the study of the ars dictandi, a modified form of rhetoric, occupied in the medieval curriculum of the 7 liberal arts. It remains to name the leading textbooks in the subject. Those whose content was entirely legal, in the narrow sense, will, however, be omitted. 1. While the ars dictandi was studied in Italy as early as the 6th century, the earliest collection of formulae, of the use of which as a school book there can be no doubt, is the so-called Salzburg Formularius, written not later than 821. Its arrangement, content, incidental references, and glossaries prove conclusively that it was designed as a school text of model letters, briefs, and similar documents. Such a deduction is inevitable in spite of the fact that the volume does not contain the didactic introductions on the ars dictandi. As the collection is the earliest of its kind, a brief description of it will be of interest. The book consists of 126 separate compositions occupying together about 70 pages of actual text. It contains about 25 formulae relating to lay transactions of everyday life, such as wills, sales, etc. About 10 are of a strictly legal character. 30 others are on official relations between king and vassal, archbishop and king, and the like. Only about 10 are of a distinctly ecclesiastical character. The collection contains 8 authentic letters of Alcuin to his pupil, Archbishop Arno. The rest of the documents form a miscellaneous collection of minor importance, which cannot be classified. 2. Similar in character in all particulars is the collection of the formulas of Solomon III, composed about the year 900. It contains 48 documents occupying some 50 pages of actual text. Its distinctive characteristic is the fact that one half of the collection consists of contemporaneous material written between 864 and 884. In content, it is of much greater importance than the previously mentioned collection, consisting as it does of documents on the relations between high ecclesiastics and kings. The earliest collection of epistolae proper for school use are the Epistolae Alati, composed in the second half of the 9th century. This contains 7 letters. The name of the author and the place of composition cannot be ascertained, but of its use as a textbook in a monastic school, the contents of the work give adequate proof. The letters are mainly an imaginary correspondence between a teacher and a pupil. 4. In the Rationes Dictandi of Alberic of Monte Cassino, we have the first textbook in which the theory of letter composition is laid down. Alberic, a teacher of the 11th century, was the author of 2 other more extended works on dictamen, the Flores Rhetorici sive dictaminum radii, and the Breviarum de Dictamine, both of which are unpublished. 5. The Rationes Dictandi Prosaici was composed between 1119 and 1124 by Hugo of Bologna. A number of complete manuscripts of this textbook are in existence today. The work is in every respect based on that of Alberic. 6. The Summa Dictaminis of Orléans, composed in the last decade of the 12th century, is an anonymous composition. It is the briefest textbook on dictamen extant. It follows Alberic in every detail and adds 4 chapters on as many different kinds of privilegia. Its brevity is remarkable when we consider the fact that Orléans at the time was the best-known center of classical literary culture. The cursory character of the text seems to indicate that at Orléans, more attention was paid to the classical idea of rhetoric, that is, reading of the ancient rhetoricians and historians, than to the medieval study of dictamen and epistles. 7. The Summa Dictandi of Guido Faba, a teacher of Bologna, composed about 1225, is a theoretical treatment of the ars with special reference to the epistola. His Dictamina Rhetorica is a practical companion volume with excerpts from many writers. 8. While the last 4 textbooks on dictamen owe their origin to Italy, where, as we have seen, the Ars Dictandi was fully developed in the 11th century, we find even more elaborate collections compiled on German soil. The first and fundamental textbook of this kind is the Summa Prosarum Dictaminis, which goes under the name of Saxon Formulas. The author is unknown. We are certain, though, that the date of the composition is not later than 1230. The models are based on the illustrative material used by a teacher named Gernard, who in 1222 became Bishop of Brandenburg. It is a thorough treatise on the ars, with special illustrations of high official privilegia or literae missiles. Its contents begin with an exhaustive treatment of no less than 20 kinds of privilegia. Following this is a collection of 109 authentic documents to illustrate the principles enunciated. Its use as a textbook is attested by the number of manuscripts still in existence, by the marginal notes found on them, and by the fact that at least 2 other famous German collections are based on this work. 9. The Summa Dictaminum of Ludolf of Hildesheim is of special interest. It contains, as is evident from even a cursory examination of the text, a traditional brief treatment of the Epistola prefixed to an extended discourse on literae missiles, and almost the entire set of illustrative letters of the Saxon collection described above. Here, again, the content of the volume shows unmistakable evidence that it was designed as a textbook. This is, moreover, strengthened by the existence of commentaries on the text. 10. The Summa de Arte Prosandi by Conrad of Moor, a Rector Puerorum at Zurich, is but one of his many other school treatises. It is avowedly a compilation arranged in 1275. The characteristic of this treatise is its thoroughgoing dialectical character. Distinction upon distinction is drawn. Divisions and subdivisions are made, until all possible cases are exhausted. Thus, the author treats under different headings who sends the letter, to whom, for whom, how, when, etc. Endless lists of all possible persons who could be addressed, including even the ancient imperial Roman officials, are given. Of these, he mentions the titles of 90. Likewise, 138 secular and 50 ecclesiastical titles are named and recombined under different headings. Yet there is hardly an illustration in the entire work. Conrad's book may be said to typify the scholastic character which at this time pervaded even such an avowedly practical study as the Ars Dictandi. 11. The Poetria de Arte Prosaica Metrica et Rhythmica by Johannes de Garlandia, the Englishman, was written about 1270. The portion de Arte Prosaica contains the material of the instruction in rhetoric and dictamen, dialectically treated in fantastic fashion. 12. The so-called Baumgartenberg Formularius de Modo Prosandi is a compilation dating as late as 1302. It anticipates the form which these treatises came to have in later years of the 14th century. Its size, elaborate and exhaustive, though not entirely dialectical treatment, the wealth of its illustrative material, much of it borrowed from the Saxon collection, stamps the work as more of a book of reference in the schools than as a manual which teacher and pupil used in the study of the dictamen. Not the least interesting portion of this book is the brief summary of the legal principles added as a sexta pars to the work. 13. The Summula Dictaminis collected by Bernold of Kaiserheim in 1312 may similarly be classed as a teacher's reference book. Omitting the elementary treatise on dictamen, the author devotes a brief chapter to the Salutatio, of which copious examples are given. His second book has classified collections of hackneyed proverbia et sententia for insertion in the letter. These are culled, as the author tells us, from the Liber Decretalis, Seneca, Solomon, and various other sources. The other portion of the work is devoted to illustrative models of different kinds. With the spread of the universities in the 14th century, and the students flocking to them to take up the study of logic, the attention to dictamen naturally decreased. The technical part became stereotyped into tabulae. The other portions were taken up in connection with the study of law. Very few universities offered lectures on the dictamen. End of The Seven Liberal Arts, A Study in Medieval Culture by Paul Abelson, 1906. Part 3, on Rhetoric. Read by Dan Attrell. If you would like to support more work such as this, please visit patreon.com/themodernhermeticist. And above all, thank you for listening.